So I went downhill biking and I managed to break my scaphoid. Now it's not a part of the bike, it's one of those tiny bones in the wrist that all have funny names and take a long time to heal. So after a quick surgery and getting 2 brand new titanium screws in my wrist, it's been now 4 months since I've been able to play the guitar, but I'm slowly recovering. Yeah, it turns out that having a flexible wrist is pretty crucial both when playing guitar and buttoning your pants, but let's just not go into details there. So, as there's not that much I can do guitar-wise, I thought that I can do a quick talking video with some inspirational stories about musicians who overcame seemingly career-ending permanent injuries and continued to play on. You know, like in that movie when there's an upcoming shred guitarist that gets his fingers shredded in a terrible bullying accident, loses all his friends, spends his time drinking from a paper-wrapped bottle, and finally meets some new friends who build him robot hands and teach him how to EDM, and that movie gets it completely wrong and he becomes a Daft Punk ripoff and ends up scooting away with Christina Applegate. Oh yeah, and he actually gets his revenge on the bullies by giving them tinnitus. Whoa, tinnitus, that's a totally killer name for a heavy metal band. Okay, so to make things clear, we will exclude musicians who were either born with a disability or who were already disabled when starting their serious musical career. So we have already mentioned tinnitus, which is usually caused by noise-induced hearing loss, as explained by Julianne Moore in Children of Men.
You know that ringing in your ears? That's the sound of the ear cells dying. Once it's gone, you'll never hear that frequency again.
This movie is so underrated. So speaking of hearing loss, we have to mention Beethoven. No, not that one. Yeah, that's better. I guess you should have heard of him, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 250 years, in which case I just hope you are the proper kind of vampire, not the sparkly teen fiction metrosexual Batman guy. So the story is that just like some of his fans, Beethoven had quite a temper, and one day he was quietly working on one of his masterpieces when he was brutally interrupted, and this made him really angry. He had a fit of rage and he accidentally fell to the ground in the middle of his Hulk out. When he got up, he was deaf. Well, at least that's how he told the story at one point. On other occasions, he said that the hearing loss was gradual and he blamed it on gastric problems, but the rage story is way cooler than even the most epic food poisoning. Of course, there's about 10 million theories of what could actually be the cause of his hearing problems, ranging from birth defects to aliens. But what we know for sure is that he never regained his hearing completely, and at one point he had to use pen and paper to communicate with other people. And we know it has gotten only worse over time. Still, he never gave up, and most of his best works were completed after the hearing loss began, and some of them when he was completely deaf. So, how did he do it? Well, the basic tool of a composer are not his ears, but what's in between them. And that remained intact. You see, back then there was no Pro Tools, so the composer had to imagine a piece of music, make sure that every part is actually playable on the instrument it's supposed to be played on, and finally make sure that it's all going to sound good together. Also, there were very few rehearsals. Composers were writing music for entire orchestras, and they would actually have to pay everybody to show up and go bankrupt. So they were able to hear their music only at the very end of the entire process, usually when there was little time for corrections. So basically they had to really know their shit, as they were working in their heads 99% of the time. They just had to know how it all will sound like. And once you know that, you don't really need ears, because you have already heard it in your mind. Hearing loss is something very common both among musicians and music lovers, especially since amplification was invented. And it creeps up on you. It's very hard to notice in the beginning and only gets worse over time. So if you play weekly rehearsals with your rock, blues, heavy metal band or go to live shows a lot, just get yourself a good set of earplugs. And not the ones you can get in a pharmacy, because those will make the music sound crap, but hi-fi ones like Vibes or Elasin or even ones from Fender. Those will set you back around $20, but listen to me very carefully now. So did you hear the beep? If not, you already may have some hearing loss. And yes, there was a beep, I'm not messing around with you. Just get yourself a pair and don't be like Ludwig van. As Julian explained, you'll never be able to get that beep back, but you can stop yourself from losing even more. And also, if you have heard the beep, you need to press the like button right now, and if you didn't, you need to leave a sub, or just do both. So, where were we? Oh yeah, Def Leppard. They are a heavy metal band from the UK, kind of like Sirius Steel Panther. 1983 was a great year for them. They had a breakaway success with their third album, Pyromania. They toured the USA with AC/DC, dated models and struggled with hardcore alcoholism, just like me, but only the last part. And at the end of that great year, their drummer, Rick Allen, was driving home for Christmas in his brand new Corvette, and he lost his arm in a car crash. And I mean the entire arm, from the shoulder down. The doctors tried to reattach it, but it became infected and they had to amputate it in the end. Now, Rick was an extremely talented guy. He was only 21 and he already was the drummer for one of the biggest bands in the world. Losing an arm seems like a total career end for a drummer, and many people thought it was going to be the case with Rick. But Rick had a different opinion. He built himself a sophisticated custom drum rig with a lot of electronic trigger pedals and spent over a year relearning the drums. Easy peasy. He redebuted 18 months after the accident on Monsters of Rock festival, playing alongside guys like Ozzy and Lemmy, and while the band brought a backup drummer, it wasn't needed because Rick totally nailed it. After proving his worth live, he joined the band in the studio, where they recorded their most successful album, Hysteria. And if you think that they should have made a movie about him instead of that crappy Vibrations flick we've talked about, there's a VH1 movie about them, it's called Hysteria, and I think somebody even uploaded the whole thing to YouTube. And there are also some really good interviews with Rick here on YouTube, so just use the search button wherever it is. So speaking of British heavy metal bands, there was this British band called Rocking Chevrolets, which I think is as bad band name as Electric Kias, and their guitarist was still working as a welder in a, wait for it, metal shop. Thank you. On his very last day at that place, he was asked to work a hydraulic press that he was not even trained to use. Being a nice guy, he agreed, and the thing that usually happens when you try to play around with a 20-ton Arnold killing machine you're not even trained to use happened. The press snapped off his ring and middle finger fingertips. He was rushed to a hospital, but they basically just cleaned up his wounds and told him, no more guitar for you, sir. Obviously he was depressed about it, but the owner of the workshop visited him in the hospital and told him a really inspirational, motivating story that put him back on the tracks to becoming a real guitar hero. And from that point, the unfortunate guitarist did everything he could to get back on the guitar train. He found out that there are no prosthetics available for cases like his. So he made his own from a ferry bottle and some old leather jackets. When he realized that he's not able to bend or even press the strings, first he drop tuned to reduce the tension, and when that wasn't enough, he decided to change his strings to a lighter gauge. But basically, light gauge strings were not invented yet. So he made his own string set using a combination of banjo and guitar strings. Then came changes to his playing technique. He started using less complex chords and worked out a more economical, less noodling based and more riff-oriented style of playing and songwriting. He played in a lot of bands. He founded a band called Polka Attack that later changed their name to Earth. Then he briefly played with Jethro Tull, who was a pretty big name back then, and it's a really interesting and pretty much forgotten band, so check it out. And one thing he learned from his tenure at Jethro Tull was that you need to practice and take music seriously if you want to make it. And with that lesson learned, he came back to Earth, and I mean the band, not the planet, and forced some discipline, like making sure that everybody is actually sober and actually shows up to the rehearsals, and so on. A few months later, somebody in that band realized that their name sounds a little bit too hippie, and they changed their name to Tinnitus. No, I'm kidding. Black Sabbath. I guess you might have heard of them, and yeah, the guitarist's name is Tony Iommi. And with drop tunings, simplified chords and a lot of riffs, they became the world's first definitely heavy metal band, and Tony is often named as one of the most influential guitarists of all time. So you might be wondering, what was the story that the workshop owner told to a 17-year-old Tony Iommi that inspired him to make prosthetic fingers instead of just suing the hell out of the owner? Well, to find out, let's move to 1927 to Belgium, land of chocolate and french fries, where a 17-year-old Romani musician was on his way to bed when he knocked over a candle. Unfortunately, his wife was busy all day making fake celluloid flowers. And if you watched enough Tarantino movies, you know that celluloid is flammable enough to finish World War II in 5 minutes. And speaking of Tarantino, the musician's name was Django. The D is silent. Apparently there's no direct connection there. So on that night, Django barely made it alive out of his wagon. He suffered major burns and spent over a year recovering from them. Apart from his leg being nearly amputated, the burns rendered his ring and pinky fingers in the left hand practically paralyzed. At that point, Django was already an acclaimed musician, as was his father, brother and later both of his sons. You see, Django was Romani, and Roma people did not grow food, they didn't settle down, didn't take paycheck jobs and instead focus on freelancing professions, such as tinkering, entertainment, especially music, and I guess also making celluloid flowers. There are a lot of gypsy influences in Western music. Apart from inspiring guys like Brahms, Liszt or Ravel and giving Carlos Santana at least 30% of his song titles, there's even a gypsy scale, and it's a really interesting one. So for Django, his music was his life and his family trait. He just knew that he has to get back into music, especially that the other option, making celluloid flowers, just wasn't gonna play. So he switched from banjo guitar to guitar and decided to join this new fad in music called jazz. And at that point, guitar was not really a solo instrument in jazz. It was simply not loud enough to compete with brass section or even instruments like piano. But Django was about to change that. He, his brother and 3 other musicians founded a quintet consisting of 3 guitars, a violin and a double bass. In this setting, with no noisy brass section, the guitar could really shine as a solo instrument. Django and his brother brought a lot of gypsy influences to the band's music, and thus we have a whole subgenre of gypsy jazz. So how good could his solos be if he only had 2 fingers? Yeah, he basically totally shredded. So Django went on to play with the best in jazz, including guys like Duke Ellington. He played Carnegie Hall twice and became a sort of pop culture legend, being referenced in countless movies, including the spoof documentary Sweet and Lowdown by Woody Allen, where he is basically a kind of off-screen god. He managed to survive the war in Paris, where the Nazis were hunting down both Romani people and jazz musicians, and he died in 1953 from a brain hemorrhage. And he is still being considered one of the most influential jazz guitarists of all time, and he did all that with only half the fingers. And that's it. So I hope that you find those stories interesting and inspiring, and I also hope that you have heard the beep, and if you didn't, just go and get yourself a pair of earplugs like right now. If you think that I have missed anybody or messed something up, just be sure to leave a comment, and if you want more videos like this, just leave a thumbs up and subscribe. Hopefully I'll be able to do another tutorial or review or even maybe record a song and put it here, but in the meantime I'm off to do my wrist stretches, drink some milk and play with my brand new Swarovski passive mixer. Peace out!